After over a decade of monumental success with the original Game Boy and its other iterations, the Game Boy Pocket and the Game Boy Color, Nintendo would finally release their follow-up handheld system in 2001, dubbed the Game Boy Advance. The Game Boy Advance featured bolstered graphical capabilities, a larger screen, and a snazzy new look. With the release of the Game Boy Advance SP, the Game Boy would finally feature a backlit screen as well. In many ways, the Game Boy Advance was the ultimate version of the Game Boy, as it was more compact, particularly with the clamshell design of the SP, wireless connectivity, and its backwards compatibility of the entire Game Boy library. To a Super Nintendo nut such as myself, the Game Boy Advance was the ultimate handheld console at that point, given all of the amazing ports of Super NES games, as well as the exciting new games being released that in many ways were like a continuation of those Super NES days that I so cherished. For this video, let's take a trip down memory lane and have a look at what some of the best titles for the Game Boy Advance are. Number 20, Sword of Mana. As a remake of the first Mana game, originally titled Final Fantasy Adventure for the Game Boy, Sword of Mana breathes new life into the first entry of the series, boasting colorful new visuals, game mechanics, and incorporating elements from previous Mana games. It's a great introduction to the series for those new to it, following two characters whose stories parallel each other, giving the player the option to play as either the hero or the heroine. The soundtrack and visuals are stunning on the Game Boy Advance, and the gameplay features similar action RPG elements as in previous Mana games, such as the hack and slash attacks and the ring command system. One of many excellent RPGs on the Game Boy Advance. Number 19, TMNT. As an adaptation to a fairly average Ninja Turtles film, this game is way better than it needed to be. Featuring the classic kick-some-shell beat-em-up action that was standard for Turtles games up until that point, TMNT is a really fun button masher that sports some killer music, great sprite design with really expressive characters, and bodacious action. If you're a fan of other great Turtles games like Turtles in Time or Hyperstone Heist, don't sleep on this underrated gem. Number 18, Final Fantasy Tactics Advance. Very much in the same vein as the PlayStation classic Final Fantasy Tactics, Tactics Advance puts a new spin on the traditional Final Fantasy gameplay, incorporating a tactical turn-based system. The story follows four children who, after opening a magical book, are transported to the land of Ivalice. The game features 34 different job classes, different laws set by judges which affect the way battles are fought, and a customizable map. Final Fantasy Tactics Advance's vibrant visuals, engaging story, and awesome music make it a must-play RPG for the Game Boy Advance. Number 17, Advance Wars. The first of the Wars series of games to be released outside of Japan. Not the only instance of a Japan-only franchise being released in the West for the Game Boy Advance for the first time. Advance Wars puts its own spin on the tactical strategy-based gameplay by incorporating various different elements to the overall strategy of the game, as well as the battle tactics such as various different units utilizing different weapons, environmental aspects of the terrain affecting the outcome of battles, and the commanding officers offering strategic advantages and disadvantages. The multiplayer option on the Game Boy Advance is excellent too, whether via a second link cable or even in the versus mode. There's even an option to customize the different maps and settings in multiplayer battles. Overall, a really unique and fresh take on the tactical strategy genre. Number 16, WarioWare Inc. Mega Micro Games. Marking the debut of one of Nintendo's now long-standing franchises, as well as the entrepreneurial aspirations of a certain beloved yellow-clad garlic-loving greedy trickster, WarioWare Inc. Mega Micro Games is a truly unique and original game that incorporates fast-paced, bite-sized mini micro games that range everywhere from simple platformer or shooter games to condensed versions of Nintendo classics like Donkey Kong and Balloon Fight, all weaved together across 9 different stages and featuring a host of new original characters who join Wario in his new enterprise. Although these mini-games are only seconds long, they can be incredibly addictive and plentiful, as the game boasts upwards of 200 microgames. Wow! That Wario might be greedy, but he's sure not cheap in terms of the quantity of games available. Number 15, Mario Kart Super Circuit. In true spirit of the portable Super Nintendo aspect of the console, Mario Kart would have to make its handheld debut on the Game Boy Advance. Featuring the same cast of characters from Mario Kart 64, and largely the same controls and items from Super Mario Kart, as well as all of the courses from the latter game as unlockables, Super Circuit is really the perfect blend of the first two Mario Kart games, but has its own unique style as well as smoother gameplay than the first two games. Super Circuit sports colorful graphics, and while yes, they are a little dated retrospectively, nevertheless, the game looks really great on the Game Boy Advance. Number 14, Kirby and the Amazing Mirror. With any list of the greatest handheld games on a Nintendo console, a Kirby game is basically a requirement, right? Kirby and the Amazing Mirror is a fun and unique game in the Kirby franchise, sporting a more Metroidvania style of gameplay, with non-linear progression and exploration. The Mirror World features levels with various different paths in which the player can traverse in whatever order they want. In addition, the game features multiplayer, with the ability to call one of the other 3 Kirbys in for support. Overall, a fun little overlooked gem in the Kirby series. Number 13, Fire Emblem 7. Like the aforementioned Advance Wars, Fire Emblem made its international debut on the Game Boy Advance with the 7th installment of the series, known as Fire Emblem 7, The Blazing Blade, or simply Fire Emblem to Western audiences. For many people, it was their introduction to the series, and features many memorable characters and scenes. Like previous entries in the series, the gameplay is the tactical role-playing format, featuring characters in different factions battling on a grid. These battles really ramp up, and provide a lot of strategic challenge later in the game. One of the really memorable aspects of the game is the interplay between the characters whose stats and relationships are directly affected by their use in battles, and provide interesting dialogue between them. Add flashy battle animations, gorgeous sprite work, and great music, and you have perhaps the best tactical strategy game for the Game Boy Advance. Number 12, Sonic Advance. After years of intense rivalry between the two companies, Sega's Sonic Advance would mark the debut of the Blue Blur on a Nintendo console. Featuring largely the same formula that made the original Sonic games so fun and addicting on the Sega Genesis, such as fast-paced platforming, ring collecting, and 9 new zones to explore, Sonic Advance puts its own little spin on classic 2D Sonic action. The game features 4 playable characters in Sonic, Tails, Knuckles, and Amy, all with different abilities, which makes going through the game a unique experience with each. The graphics are super colorful and flashy, and the art style, for being a traditional 2D Sonic game, has its own feel and personality. Sonic Advance is an underrated gem in the Sonic catalog, and an essential game on the Game Boy Advance. Number 11, Castlevania, Aria of Sorrow. All 3 Castlevania games on the Game Boy Advance were excellent entries in the series that really helped usher in the new Metroidvania style that had been established in Symphony of the Night. Circle of the Moon was the first game to bring this new style to the Game Boy Advance, and featured a unique card system. Harmony of Dissonance was the first produced by series veteran Koji Igarashi, and streamlined the RPG mechanics a bit more. However, it all really came together with Aria of Sorrow. Featuring the best graphics, music, story, and gameplay of the 3, Aria of Sorrow also brought a unique tactical soul system to the gameplay, allowing the player to absorb souls from enemies to unlock abilities. All 3 games are worth your time, but if you have to go with one, definitely choose Aria of Sorrow. Hey, before we get to the top 10, you may have noticed a lack of ports on this list. There are a ton of great ones on the Game Boy Advance, but for the purpose of having more games unique to the Game Boy Advance on this list, remakes aside, I chose to leave them off. That said, please enjoy this montage of some of the very best ports on the Game Boy Advance. Number 10, Drill Dozer. A highly entertaining action platformer created by Game Freak, yes, the Pokémon people. Drill Dozer is super addictive, with flashy visuals, cool sprites, killer music, and really fun and unique gameplay. The player utilizes a drill to go through levels, which can be upgraded as you collect different gears, which makes the drill more powerful. These other gears are triggered through a time button mechanic which, when mastered, is really satisfying to execute. The game's levels are huge, with lots of exploration and puzzle solving, and the art style is really cute and original. Drill Dozer is an excellent, often overlooked platformer and a great game for the Game Boy Advance. Number 9. The Legend of Zelda: The Minish Cap. While I wouldn't say that the Minish Cap is amongst the greatest Zelda games of the franchise, or even pushes any major boundaries, it's certainly a unique and fun one to play. The Minish Cap is very much in the vein of a classic, top-down Zelda with some interesting little novelties. Link sports Eslo, or the Minish Cap as it is known, which allows him to shrink down in size. This ability is key throughout the game to solve puzzles, explore hidden areas, and even to fight bosses. Additionally, there are kinstones which can be collected throughout the game that can be fused to further progress or obtain items. Minish Cap is also unique in its quirky art style and that it features a new antagonist named Vati, a wizard who turns Princess Zelda and the king to stone. Overall, a really solid entry in the Zelda series and a must for the Game Boy Advance. Number 8. Wario Land 4. Wario Land, for a brief time, was a huge series for the Game Boy, and the fourth entry, the only game of the series released on the Game Boy Advance, may be the greatest of them all. Wario Land 4 brings back elements from previous entries in the series and polishes them up. The visuals and sound is some of the very best on the Game Boy Advance, and there are lots of great little animations or expressions that Wario makes that gives the game a lot of personality. The gameplay is more fast-paced than the previous games, with lots of puzzle solving and collectibles. While many of Wario's abilities have returned from previous games, like tossing enemies or charging at them, a health bar was added, which makes the game a bit more difficult from its predecessors. Wario Land 4 is an excellent platformer that embodies the very best of the console. Number 7. Golden Sun. In true spirit of the golden age of JRPGs that were prevalent on the Super Nintendo, the Game Boy Advance had its fair share of both excellent ports of great Super Nintendo RPGs, as well as great original titles. Of all of these, Camelot's Golden Sun is really a bright spot on the Game Boy Advance's excellent library. Golden Sun's epic story, memorable characters, and beautiful graphics and art style really make it stand out on its own. The magic system, utilizing a telepathic ability called Psi Energy or Synergy, whatever it's called, allows the player to move objects and interact with the environment. The game follows a protagonist named Isaac from a small village named Vale. When the elemental stars are stolen by Saturus and Minardi, who are forced to flee after a volcanic eruption, they set off to light the 4 lighthouses to re-release destructive alchemy on the world of Wayard. It's up to Isaac and his friends to stop them. Golden Sun is a shining example of a great JRPG. Number 6. Pokémon Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald. The first 2 generations of Pokémon set the world on fire with their addictive gameplay, engaging stories, and of course, the lovable pocket monsters themselves. When it was time for the series to make the jump to the Game Boy Advance with Ruby and Sapphire, several new features were added, as well as brand new Pokémon, sprite designs, and of course, a whole new region to explore in Hoenn. Ruby and Sapphire were really vibrant games, and the graphics and animations really pop on the Game Boy Advance. They also introduced several new features such as double battles and Pokémon abilities and natures, which directly affect the individual Pokémon's stats. These new elements added a huge new level of strategy and later competitive edge to the series as a whole. Hoenn's story was really interesting as well. While yes, the game follows the same linear format as the previous 2 gens, there's plenty of new stuff to make the story interesting, particularly with Team Aqua and Team Magma. Emerald, of course, was released a couple years later, which included more Pokémon as well as some graphical and gameplay tweaks. While Emerald is the definitive version to play, all 3 games are excellent. Number 5. Metroid Zero Mission. As far as remakes go, it can't get much better than Metroid Zero Mission. Essentially a complete overhaul of the very first Metroid, and even including the original game on the same cartridge, Zero Mission improves the original game drastically, with gorgeous graphics, music, and some much needed quality of life changes, including a map and save points. Additionally, there are new items and upgrades, as well as new areas. The game also features a new sequence at the end where the player plays as Samus without her power suit. She's more vulnerable to attacks and has to sneak around. This Zero Suit Samus was the first time in the series where the player can play as Samus without her suit on. The game also fleshed out the story of Metroid a bit more, focusing on Samus's backstory and told through some beautifully rendered cutscenes. Metroid Zero Mission is a blast to play, and one of the best 2D Metroid games. Number 4. Mario & Luigi Superstar Saga. After the success of games like Super Mario RPG and Paper Mario, the Mario RPG side of the Mario series really leveled up as a fun and different way to experience the Mario universe. With Mario & Luigi Superstar Saga, another new Mario RPG series would be born. Mario & Luigi is a very unique take on the Mario RPG formula. The game features similar elements to its predecessors such as the timed hits mechanic, 3D platforming, and similar weapons and armor such as the hammer. Superstar Saga has loads of quirky new elements though, such as the Bros attacks, which allow Mario and Luigi to execute more powerful moves, executed with time hits. There are also some cool little moves the brothers can do on the overworld as well, such as a propeller type technique that allows them to float for a short time, or even squashing Mario with Luigi's hammer to get to hard to reach areas. Each brother also has an elemental attack, which can be used both in battle and on the overworld. Mario and Luigi's plot, in traditional fashion, is both engaging and at times just hilarious. The graphics and sound are also really vibrant, and little animations and expressions the brothers do are a nice touch that add a lot of humor and personality to the game. Mario & Luigi Superstar Saga is a highly entertaining and fresh take on the Mario RPG formula. Number 3, Pokémon Fire Red and Leaf Green. Another excellent remake for the Game Boy Advance. Pokémon Fire Red and Leaf Green are really the definitive versions of the Gen 1 era of Pokémon, featuring a complete graphical overhaul as well as some much needed quality of life improvements such as the ability to run, a more streamlined inventory, as well as fixing the many countless bugs the original games had. Fire Red and Leaf Green are two of the best games of the series. The developers did a great job of keeping the same tone and feel of the original games, while incorporating a lot of improvements that were made in Ruby and Sapphire. This also includes new features from those games like the double battles, natures, and abilities. The game looks gorgeous and sounds great with flashy battle animations and a much needed overhaul of the Pokemon sprites. The game features a few minor tweaks to the story, as well as the ability to challenge trainers you have already defeated to a rematch. There's also an entirely new area called the Sevi Islands, which feature Pokemon from the Johto region and the ability to trade between Ruby and Sapphire. Fire Red and Leaf Green are really the gold standard for both Pokemon and remakes as a whole. Number 2, Metroid Fusion. With Metroid Fusion and Metroid Prime for the GameCube, which was released a day later, the Metroid series made its triumphant return after an 8-year absence. While Prime brought the series to new heights with its innovative first-person perspective and excellent graphics, Metroid Fusion brought the series back to its roots with classic 2D Metroidvania-style gameplay. However, Fusion wasn't just a carbon copy of Super Metroid. It very much had its own unique style, feel, and brought forth new elements to the series. Its dark atmosphere and sometimes chilling scenes give it a cosmic horror element to it. Fusion, unlike previous games, followed a more linear style with a heavier emphasis on story. When Samus is exposed to a parasite called the X that attacks her central nervous system, it fuses the organic parts of her suit to her after a cure for the virus is injected into her from the Metroid hatchling in Super Metroid. The rest of the infected suit is sent to the BSL station, which Samus later investigates, and where the game largely takes place. Metroid Fusion's gameplay takes a lot of elements from previous games like items, weapons, and backtracking, but adds new features like edge grabbing and the ability to absorb the X parasite to gain abilities. Metroid Fusion is an excellent return to the Metroid series. Number 1, Mother 3. It's interesting to note that what is considered one of the greatest Game Boy Advance games was never released outside of Japan, and gamers still haven't let Nintendo forget that fact. Following a brutal development that ultimately culminated in the game being cancelled for the Nintendo 64, Mother series creator Shigesato Itoi decided to start Mother 3 from scratch for the Game Boy Advance. As the sequel to Earthbound for the Super Nintendo and the third and final entry of the Mother trilogy, Mother 3 took different gameplay mechanics and thematic elements from its two predecessors, polished them up, and alongside a truly heart-wrenching story full of quirky humor, commentary on both moral and society issues, and well, some pretty strange and wacky stuff, created a masterpiece. Mother 3 really embodies the spirit of the series and its creator in a way that really affects the player with emotional scenes, memorable characters, and an overall unique experience unlike any other game. The battle system is largely the same as Earthbound, with a new rhythm bashing mechanic that can deal more damage to enemies, as well as new PSI attacks. Little improvements such as a more streamlined inventory and a run button, as well as the overall pacing, make Mother 3 in some ways a more user-friendly version of Earthbound, although the two games are vastly different. Truly an epic story and an emotional experience for anyone willing to put the time into it. If even on the fan base alone, whom have shown so much dedication to the game by petitioning Nintendo for its release in the West, and even spearheading an unofficial English translation, it more than deserves the top spot as the greatest game for the Game Boy Advance. Hey, thanks everyone for checking out this video, I really appreciate it. What are your top 20 favorite Game Boy Advance games, and how did I do? I'm genuinely curious about what other people's favorite games are, so feel free to leave your own list in the comments below. I got lots of other stuff you can watch linked here and on the channel, including more top 10s and other retro game content, such as reviews and all kinds of other stuff. Also, consider checking out our friendly neighborhood Discord if you want to get a little deeper into this channel. Thank you everybody again. Peace.